and welcome to Editing Essentials, Splitting and Alignment. I'm Penny Muncaster-Jewell. In this class, I'm going to teach you how to split and align your embroidery designs perfectly. You'll learn how alignment lines can extend the limits of your hoop so that you can go as big as your imagination can take you. By the end of this class, you'll have the confidence to split any design for any size hoop. I spent most of my working life in Houston as a software consultant for NASA. But it's now my mission to prove that computerized embroidery isn't rocket science. I'm originally from the northeast of England, but moved to Texas in 1980 with my husband Steve. I have taught digitizing classes all over the world. I've also written books on getting the most out of your software, and I love simplifying the process for my students. We'll start very simply by sewing and aligning a basic circle design. Then I'll show you how alignment takes all the guesswork out of your project. Next, knowing where to split a design creates seamless results. You'll then learn to trust your eye over what the software suggests. And we'll end the class by learning how to repeat a design to create continuous borders. You'll find some useful resources in your class materials, so download the design file so you can follow along. I'm here to help you, so if you have any questions, please be sure to ask. I'd also love to see what you're working on. Don't be shy, post your pictures and your questions. Let's get started. In this lesson, you'll see how stitching and alignment works by actually sewing out a split design. Then you'll understand the process. You'll see two different ways to realign your design, and then you'll learn how to correct an incorrectly aligned design, because trust me, you will generally do a realignment wrong at least once. So, why do you even need to know how to do this? This way, you'll be able to do large designs. I know even if you have one of the bigger machines that have the super duper hoop sizes, you'll still want to do a design that's larger than that. So this way, you'll be able to do things like a big butterfly design on the back of a jacket, do borders on pants or on the jacket, and also even banners with large text. Imagine doing your family reunion in text. The other thing is, I learned this lesson the hard way. Many years ago, when I first got back into embroidery, my husband got into marlin fishing. He wanted me to do a marlin flag for his boat called 42. And at that time, my biggest hoop size was 5 by 7, and this needed to be big enough to be able to be seen. So this was about the size of my hoop, and as you can see, if I hold it over the flag areas, you can see that they will not fit inside the hoop. And in fact, the wave and the marlin cannot fit in because the wave goes outside of the area. But bear in mind that this size is actually smaller than that because the sewing size itself is not as big as the hole in the hoop. So luckily, I was able to work out how to do it and save my marriage, and we're still married today. So the key ingredient to learning how to do this is to use sticky paper. So we'll do that next. I want to start by focusing on the process rather than the design itself. I know what you really want to do is to go ahead and sew out like a butterfly, which is going to take us about 6 hours, or maybe not quite as long as that, for you to find out that you really don't understand the process itself of how to do alignment. So we're going to back up and start with a very, very simple design. In fact, it's a circle. It's the outline of a circle. It's not even filled in. And the reason I do this is so that you can try this several times. This will be in your class materials. And to begin with, we're going to start off by hooping our sticky paper. So when I'm ready to hoop with my sticky paper, what I do is I take the hoop that I'm going to use and I place it on my sticky paper. I affectionately refer to this as the blue gridded stuff, and because it's actually called Filmoplast, which is very hard to pronounce. What I do is I make sure I've got enough room so that it's larger than the hoop. And then I'm just going to cut it down. Don't worry if it's too big. It's better for it to be too big than for it to be too small. So now what I can do is I can bring in the other part of the hoop. And notice that they have little arrows that match up at the top. Now, one of the things is when you're doing this, you need to make sure that you've released the tension on the outer hoop And then you're going to place your sticky paper on top and approximately center it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, then you're going to take your hoop. When I'm hooping, I always use a flat surface, and your knees are not a flat surface, because you also need to sometimes apply some pressure as you're pushing the hoop down into the outer hoop. Also, depending on which of the papers you're using, some of the paper releases that they have on them are actually quite thick, so you may end up having to press quite hard when you're doing it. This is one of the reasons I like the blue gutted paper. So once I've got it in, then I can tighten up my outer hoop, and now I've got it in position. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to take this very expensive instrument called a straight pin. And I'm going to use this just to score gently on the release paper. Now, if you press too hard, you will put a hole in the sticky paper. Ask me how I know that. So then you'd have to start again. So now what we're going to do is we just kind of lightly apply some pressure and it will come up, and we're going to rip it off. And of course, if I was Eleanor Burns, I would throw this over my shoulder and expect some little minion to come in and pick it up. But not in my studio, and I haven't trained the dog yet. So once I've done this, what I've now done is I've exposed all of the sticky paper. So now I'm ready to actually insert my fabric. So notice that everything is lined up, and I'm going to take my fabric to which I've already applied additional stabilizer. The sticky paper itself gives you a little level of stabilization. However, normally when you're doing a really big design, what happens is it's so stitch intensive or dense that that's generally not sufficient on its own. So you probably want to go ahead. I tend to use fusible ones, or you could use regular ones and use a temporary adhesive spray. So then I go ahead and get this set up and just position it where I need it to be. Now I'm ready to go over to the machine. And of course, when you have a lovely machine like this, you don't necessarily need it. It feels embarrassing to be demonstrating this on a 4x4. But the reason why we're only using the 4x4 is so that you can practice doing this many, many times, and it won't take you a long time to do it. It would be terrible for you to do a 6-hour stitch out and find out you didn't know how. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hoop the fabric, and now that's in place. Now I'm ready to select the design that I'm going to use. So I'm going to come over here to the embroidery machine, and I've already I put my USB stick in, and I've already selected the USB option as to where I'm going to get my embroidery from. And it's come up and said that there's a folder. I'm going to select that folder, and I'm going to go to lesson 1. And now you can see that I actually have my designs available. The first one that I'm going to stitch out is the left-hand side of the circle with the alignment line, and that would be this design right here. So I'm going to click on that to select it. Now you can see it a little bit more clearly. You can see that it's a half circle of just running stitches, and then a red alignment line, which is just a straight line with a slightly longer stitch length. So it's still not ready to set because I have to tell it to set it, that's really what I meant to select, just in case I messed up. And then I need to tell it that I'm ready to go for embroidery. And let's go ahead and do that. Now if I look up here, it gives me a little bit more information. You notice that, and time-wise, the whole design only takes 1 minute to do, which is very, very quick. Okay, so basically what we will do is you'll notice that the circle gets stitched out first, and then the alignment line. Now this alignment line is to set you up for the next design piece. Okay, so now basically we are ready. Notice that when I look over here, my little light that is my stop on and off type thing is red. That means it's not quite ready yet, so I'm going to just have a quick look, make sure that everything's out of the way. But also the reason why it's objecting is that I have not lowered the presser foot. So I'm going to go ahead and lower the presser foot. Notice it now changes to green, so I'm ready to tell it to go. You probably have the similar kind of setup on your machine, and that's what you would use. So I'm just going to tell this to sew, and once again it will go off and it will start sewing. And I know this is riveting television to watch. You're probably like gasping at the excitement. Okay, so it's drawn my half circle, or stitched it. If you notice on the screen, it tells me that I'm going to change colors. I actually don't change colors. I always use the same color thread. The reason is, unless it's something that's an awful color, you're going to pick these stitches out after you've finished. So I tend to just say, okay, I will just use the same color. Notice my start button is red again. That's because it raised the presser foot. So I'm going to lower my presser foot and now just go ahead and hit start. And notice that it's stitching the alignment line after the stitches of the circle. It doesn't just stitch it right up to that half circle. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So now that it's finished, I'm going to remove this now from the embroidery machine. And I'm going to pull it out and look at it down here. Okay, so can you see that the stitches in the alignment line are actually a lot longer? They're really more like a basting stitch. So, and that's important because if you had sewn this with a regular stitch length, what would happen is you'd be digging those stitches out forever and you'd have lots of extra holes in your fabric. So we really want this to just be a marker. Now, before I remove it from the hoop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to mark the back of my alignment lines. And the reason why I do this is because sometimes it's possible that as you're taking this off the extra stabilizer, you may end up slightly losing one or two stitches at the end, and that's just because it is a large basting stitch. So what I do is I take a pen. In this case I'm using a red pen, and you would probably want to use a pen that is air erasable or can be erased, or you perhaps use chalk and then rub it off. Okay, but notice that I've marked each end of my lines. At that point, then I'm ready to go. So normally I don't just rip this out of my sticky paper because that puts too much pressure on your stitches, and often that will lead you to lose the actual stitches themselves. Okay, so typically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to release it from the hoop by taking the tension off the outer hoop, and I can lift it out and I can actually pull out my inner hoop. Now at some point I will come in and I will trim away some of this excess sticky paper before I'm ready to align this up. So now we're ready to do part 2. So I already have prepared a piece of sticky paper and I'm ready to go ahead and just score it. And like I say, this always gets very monotonous after a while. You do it repetitious, the same thing time and time again. But what you're just doing is exposing your sticky paper by taking off the release paper. Now, this is going to strike you as funny. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to put the hoop with no fabric and no thread back into our embroidery machine. So you're probably thinking, oh, wait a minute, why are we doing that? Well, the reason is because we're not going to actually stitch the next alignment line. What we're actually going to do is we're going to put holes into our sticky paper in the exact same positions where the alignment line would be. So I'm going to go ahead and pop it back in, and in it goes. Now you have a choice. You can actually leave the thread, the machine threaded. Some people prefer to do that because it makes their line a little bit clearer and easy to see. I prefer not to because it means I've got more stitches that I'm going to have to remove at a later date. So I'm just going to unthread it. And before I go anywhere, I need to bring up my second piece of the design. If I don't do that, it's a disaster. Ask me how I know. And so it's a very important step. So you're going to go back, and I'm going to go back to return, and I'm going to tell it to delete that design because it finished stitching it and I've finished with it. I'm going to go back to my USB stick, and from my lesson 1. And this time what I'm going for is the right hand part of the circle with the alignment line. So this is this one. Notice that the alignment line this time is over the stitches. And that's okay, because that circle will not get sewn until after the alignment line has stitched. So let's go ahead and set it and go to embroidery. And you see that the very first thing that's going to stitch is the alignment line. And it's marked in red, and of course we're not using any thread. Now, depending on your machine may not like to sew without thread. And we'll go ahead and try this and see what happens. So I've lowered my presser foot. I'm going to go ahead and say start, and it's actually going to go ahead and start stitching. And it says, oh no, check and rethread the upper thread with a little unhappy whippy face. And your machine may do something similar to let you know that your machine's not threaded. I just say that's fine and lower my presser foot and tell it to continue, because I want it to go all the way to the end. And you may have to repeat that saying okay and continue until it's got to the end of the alignment line completely. If you stop too early, what will happen is your alignment lines will not be the same length. So you want to make sure you go all the way to the end. So now I'm actually done with that. And so I'm now going to remove this from the embroidery machine. If we look on here, you can see my alignment lines are here. And it may be a little difficult on the camera, but a lot of times what I will do is I will actually mark in red the very last stitch point so that I can see them. Okay, so now we're actually ready to go back to our original. Okay, and remember we marked the back, and I am just going to cut away this little bit of extra sticky paper. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I am going to actually fold this. Notice how the circle is not touching the alignment line. So I am going to actually fold very carefully along that stitching line. If the stitches had actually gone into there, it would be harder for me to actually fold that. If you look very closely, you probably can actually see the separate little stitches in here. Those are the needle downs that occurred on that alignment line. And in fact, you can actually use that to help you make sure that you've lined up perfectly. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my original hoop for my second design. I'm going to check on my screen, and these are going to be lined up like this, because I need the circle to be on the bottom, and they're going to line up together. Okay, now I'm going to turn it this way so I can see a little bit more carefully what I'm doing. As you're coming in to line these up, I call this my moon landing. Goes back to my NASA days. And what you want to do is try and match them up as closely as possible, and then press down. And if you kind of look, you can actually see the individual stitches and holes lining up. Now, at this point, you're going to flip open your fabric and press it out. And now you'll be ready to go and check to test if you've got your alignment correctly. Before we do that, I'm going to show you some troubleshooting tips on how to fix them. Okay, so we've really just seen how you can do the moon landing and line up your stitch line with your line of perforated holes. And it looks like, oh, well, that's a piece of cake. It'll go like that every time. Oh, don't you wish? So here's what can happen. So in this case, when I put my fabric in and tried to line them up, I kind of went kittywampus and wobbled a little bit. And so as a result, if I just stitched that out and ignored doing the test run to see if it had lined up correctly, then what would happen is I would end up with this. This is not good. This is not the look you're going for. So really what you have to do in that case is pull it out and start again. But I will show you how this can happen. In this particular case, what we did here was when I put them in, I either moved it forward a little bit or back a little bit. So the lines were actually parallel, but they were offset. And so if you think of them as being like railway tracks, okay, they're both parallel with each other. Now the problem with this is that if you do that, then you're going to either get an overlap or you're going to get a gap, depending on how much you're offset. These you will fix using the embroidery machine, and we will go through doing that when we get into the troubleshooting. So if you notice, we now have our hoop, and what I've done to make it easier for you to see a little bit more clearly what's going on is we've marked all the individual holes in black. And if you look very carefully, you would be able to see that from a stitch out we did for this one, you will actually see that the holes are actually offset but parallel, and you can see they're lining up perfectly. So we actually got the position correct in terms of left to right, but up and down, but not left to right. So let's deal with this one first, which is where you put it in and you go kittywampus. Now this may happen because the cat walks through or the phone goes or whatever. So as you're coming in for your moon landing, you're coming in, and instead of doing this, you go offset. And you can actually see that it's offset quite significantly there. If you just opened that up and stitched it, this would be what you would get. There is no way for you to correct this other than ripping it off and starting again. I know you would like a better answer, but that's it. Okay, so what happens if you overshoot something? And you can do it either way. Sometimes you're coming down to land and you're perfectly lined up and you just move forward just a little twidget, okay? Or you're coming down to land and you move back. So let's go ahead and I'm going to move it back. Okay, so you can see my red lines are matching up, but I'm really not matching up to the black holes, which is where I really need to be. And sometimes this can happen because you've got a thicker fabric or because you've got several layers of stabilizer in there. So let's just say for the time being, I'm totally ignoring that and thinking I've got that in perfectly. So this is where you discover that life is not perfect. So we're going to go back to our machine. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do what's called the alignment test, where what we want to do is to see how good were we at putting this in. And the thing to bear in mind is sometimes, especially when you first start, you're not going to necessarily get it right the first time, and I don't want you to worry. Okay, so I've put it back in the machine. Now what I want to do is I want to back up, and I've come back so that I'm back at my alignment line. And so the first thing I'm going to do now is I want to stitch my alignment line so that I can check to see that it lines up with the stitched one from the previous piece. So I'll go over to here and I'm going to go ahead and tell it to go to embroidery. I'm going to go to my go forward and backward stitches, and I'm going to go forward one stitch. So I'm going to turn the laser on, and as you can see here, what has happened is that where the needle is going to go down is not right where the stitched line is. So now what we need to do is we need to move the whole design over so that now our new alignment line will match up with our stitched alignment line. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use the moving on the actual embroidery machine itself. So now, what if you don't have this lovely laser pointer? And, you know, much as it's lovely on this, well, unfortunately, you're going to have to go out and buy one of these, but we're not going to do that to you. So instead, what maybe you could do is get yourself a little laser pointer and attach it to your machine with some duct tape. And then you could just go ahead and do the test that way. And I think not. So maybe what we'll do instead is do it the old-fashioned way, which is where we would turn off our laser pointer and we would hand crank the turn wheel, and then we can see where it goes down relative to our stitch line. So now that we know that we're off, how are we going to fix this? On most of your embroidery machines, you have the capability of actually moving the whole design around. But in order to do that, you first have to back up so that you're at the beginning of the design. Sometimes there's a button that says home that takes you there. Sometimes you just have to be at the start of the design. So we're going to go ahead and do this, and I'm going to raise my needle, and I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to back up a color. And notice it's now moved my needle to the center of the design. And if I look over here on my screen, I can also see that it's right in the center. But it looks like it's a lot further away. That's because it's the center of the whole design. It's not on the stitch line at this point. Now at this point, I can go to edit and I can go to move. And now notice on my screen, I have up and down, left and right, and corner handles that I can use to move the whole design. So what I need to do is move this about 4 or 5 divots or clicks on the left arrow here to move it over. Now you're going to be guessing here, and it's okay to get it wrong. And in fact, there are times it takes me several times to get it in exactly the right position, but that's okay. So, and plus, as you get to know your machine more and do more splitting and alignment, you'll have a better feel for how much to move it over. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, if you notice, the whole thing moved. Okay, not just the alignment line. So let's go back to the embroidery part, and we're going to tell it that we need to go all the way back to home, and you notice that it's actually moved it for us. So now we know we're back to home, and now we can say okay, we can go to edit, we can go to move again, and this time we need to move a little bit over to the right. Sometimes you have to be a little careful when you're moving these, because if you actually hold your finger on the screen, especially on some of these touch sensitive screens, you may get more movement than you thought you were going to get. So I'm going to do 1, 2, and I'm going to try that and see if that works. Okay, so we've now adjusted it again and we're getting ready to test it. So what we'll do is we'll go forward, and we will go ahead and go forward 1 stitch to see. And we're going to go ahead and do our hand crank to see how successful this adjustment was. And we go down, and yes, we got it. Okay, so when this happens, you will probably run outside and kiss the postman, because it's such a thrill the very first time you do this. Okay, but what you will find is it may take you a little bit of time of working with your machine, understanding how much 1 click moves it left or right or up or down. Okay, so don't worry too much about it. You can practice this for the longest time, and until you do start doing the stitch out, you can still keep using the same one that you've been working with. So it makes it very easy for you to practice. Now the last part of the test is, now that I think I've got it in perfect position, now what I'm going to do is let it go ahead and stitch the whole line. And you will not imagine the thrill as it goes in every stitch hole and keeps going all the way. Now once again, we get our little Mr. Whiny face because we still don't have thread in. And so we go ahead and let it continue all the way down. And once you get it to the point where it matches up at the beginning and at the end and all the way down, there is no way that your design cannot be aligned. Now ordinarily at this point, what you would do is you would finish off the rest of the design too. You don't ever actually stitch that second alignment line, because you would just have to pull it out and you've already verified that it's lined up perfectly. So now your homework is to practice this. You can find the circle design in your class materials, and by doing this repetitively, you'll understand how to change the layout on your particular machine so that the alignment can be perfectly done, or sometimes what you may do is just remove it and do your moon landing again. If you still have questions, we're going to be revisiting this many times in the rest of the lessons, and we're going to start bringing up some other subtleties that may come up. So in the next lesson, we'll actually create a split design by taking an existing stitch design and splitting it. So we'll actually get into something more exciting than just our circle. So I'll see you there. Thank you.